Hello class. So in this video, I really am going to go back to the slideshow and the second half of the slideshow and talk a little bit more about the basic thesis of hedonism and introduce what Schaefer-Landau has to say in chapter 1, some of the attractions of hedonism, some of the reasons for accepting the thesis, and then move briefly to think about some of the things he says in chapter 2 when he raises objections to hedonism, reasons for rejecting the basic thesis. And then that'll set up some remarks about the Heathwood piece. Heathwood has an interesting objection to hedonism in his Faring Well and Getting What You Want, and that's the article that you'll be writing about for your homework this week. So I'll introduce that at the end of this video. Okay, so that's what we're going to do. So coming back to the slideshow, and I don't want to repeat too much of what we did in class, but just to remind you, the basic thesis here, as defended by both Epicurus and Mill, is that happiness, or some part or component of happiness, is the only thing that has intrinsic value. Which means, what does that mean? That means it's the only thing that's worth pursuing for its own sake. Right? It's the only thing that is good as an end in itself. Everything else that is worth pursuing or worth desiring, everything else that has value, is either a means to happiness or itself a part of happiness. So that's the claim. That's the basic idea. That nothing else has intrinsic value. And nothing else all by itself improves our well-being. That links back to our topic, right? The hedonism is the view that happiness is the only thing that has intrinsic value. And that's another way of saying that the only thing that can improve the quality of a person's life, can make a person's life better for that person, is happiness. Okay, so we can refine that thesis a little bit, and both Epicurus and Mill do define what they mean by happiness in relation to pleasure and the absence of pain. So hedonism becomes the view that well-being consists, it's what is the good life? What is the life that we're seeking? It's a life of pleasure, free from unnecessary pain. Again, where pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things worth desiring for their own sake and the only things that make our lives intrinsically better. By the same token, pain is the only thing that makes our lives intrinsically worse. Now, you might disagree with this claim, right? And this is what we'll be getting to. What reasons do we have to accept or reject this claim? You might think there are things that have value independently of pleasure, even if they don't constitute pleasure or bring us pleasure or minimize pain. They might have intrinsic value for us, and they might be ways of making our lives better independently of pleasure. You might think also that there are ways of making a person's life worse without causing them mental or physical pain. So you can think about that, whether you have any initial reasons for rejecting the thesis, but it has an intuitive appeal, which we'll get to. It has intuitive appeal as long as we make this important distinction that Schaefer-Landau reminds us of, right? The hedonist is not saying that the only thing worth desiring for its own sake is physical pleasure. Physical pleasure, he understands this to mean a momentary feeling, a momentary experience. That's not the highest good. That's not how the hedonist defines happiness, and that's not what has intrinsic value for the hedonist, right? The hedonist is saying that an attitude of enjoyment, right? The attitude of enjoying your life, of enjoying what you're doing, of enjoying the physical pleasure, let's say, that you're having. That's what makes your life good. That's what we're seeking in life. And that's what makes our lives better or improves the quality of life, right? This positive attitude of enjoyment. Okay, so that's, again, a way of refining the view. And here at the bottom, happiness then is a positive attitude of enjoyment toward one's life as a whole. Right? The happy life is one that you enjoy it as a whole. Even though you may, during a certain week, right, be having a really bad week, right? You're experiencing lots of physical or mental anxiety or stress or pain. Nevertheless, you have a happy life because you can say that you're enjoying your life as a whole. Okay, and you're enjoying the main parts of it, like your work life, your personal life, your family life. The different parts of your life are ones as a whole that you enjoy, even though there may be moments of pain, moments of frustration. Okay, okay, so that's the idea. And that's the only thing the hedonist wants to say that has intrinsic value, this attitude of enjoyment. Okay, so Epicurus, as we talked about today, is the first philosopher to really defend this idea that the good life that we're seeking is pleasure, right? And so what does he mean? He means that the goal of life is to reach a state of inner tranquility. And that the key to achieving that state of inner tranquility is to control our desires, moderate our desires for physical pleasure, and to achieve a certain kind of clarity or understanding of some basic truths. Okay, and so we'll get to this. But he proposes what later philosophers call the four-part cure, the four-part cure to human misery. As long as we can practice these four things in our life, we can avoid misery and achieve a state of inner calm or inner tranquility. So the first is not to fear God, and Epicurus has various arguments in the letter and elsewhere as to why we shouldn't fear God, that not to worry about death, and he has various arguments as to why we shouldn't fear death. Death is nothing to fear. And then we have to come to realize that what's good is easy to get. Right? What we really need to live well is easy to get, and that what's bad, what's terrible, what in life is actually not that hard to endure, or is relatively easy to endure. Okay, so right, he's trying to kind of propose this approach to life in his letter and elsewhere. And so again, to flesh this out a little bit, the life of attitudinal pleasure, the life of inner tranquility, involves recognizing that many of the things that we take physical pleasure in, many of our desires for physical pleasure, are unnecessary, desires that we can live well without. We don't need to desire them. We don't need to satisfy those desires in order to live well. Many of those desires involve fleeting sensations, right, that lead to an excessive desire for more. And so ultimately the prolonged experience of, we experience anxiety, mental anxiety, right, in our desire for more, that produces anxiety, mental anxiety. And so the key to overcoming mental anxiety is to stop desiring things that aren't necessary, right? That's easier said than done, right? Why does Epicurus think that we shouldn't fear God's wrath? He thinks that, at least in his time, people had mistaken views about the gods or God as thinking too much about us, as caring too much about us, and being bothered by us and being overly concerned with us. And if that's your belief about God, then that leads to the thought that God will punish us for doing wrong things or reward us for doing good things. And Epicurus thought that this involved a mistake about the nature of God, right? If we come to believe that God is perfect and indestructible and unchangeable, then we'll have an idea of God as a being that has no concerns, certainly no concerns about us. And if we form that view of God and try to emulate God, a being with no concerns, then we will, first of all, stop trying really hard to please God or to avoid incurring God's wrath. And we will focus just on achieving a state of inner tranquility, kind of like a God, right? Having no cares, no concerns. That's at least Epicurus's argument. Regarding death, it's not something we ever experience, so why should we fear it? If we're never going to experience death, our own death, why should we fear it? All right, we're not going to experience the pain of death, and the only thing to fear is the experience of pain. So since we won't experience death, we have no reason to fear it. Okay, those are arguments that he makes. The other part of his view is that a lot of the painful experiences that we fight so hard to avoid are actually not that hard to endure. And we end up causing ourselves lots of anxiety, worrying too much about how to avoid pain. Okay, so he works some of those ideas out in the letter that you read. And I'm just trying to give you a sense of how Epicurean hedonism works. We talked about that today. For Mill, and this was a picture of Mill that we looked at in today's class, but Mill's version of hedonism points to a few things here that I want to focus on. Activity, right? The happiness that we're seeking in life, what makes for a happy life is an active and engaged life enjoyed in society. Not an isolated life of a loner, right? Where we're not doing anything, but really being involved in a community, involved in an activity that means something to us, and developing talent and skills, becoming excellent at it, right? That's an aspect of happiness that Mill emphasizes. So we have, in pursuing happiness, right, we have a reason to desire an active, engaged life, okay? Also, he thinks that human happiness depends on the full development of our capacities, right? Our emotional capacities, our physical capacities, but also our intellectual capacities, our creative capacities, right? So only a fully developed human can be fully happy, right? So we have a reason to desire the development of our capacities because it's a component of human happiness, Mill thinks. And then he draws this distinction between higher and lower pleasures. Many people criticize hedonism as the view that the best life for a human is a life of pleasure, in the sense, a life of experiencing physical pleasure. And this strikes many people as a doctrine that is not worthy of human beings, right? That we have higher goals in life than experiencing physical pleasure. And so Mill agrees with that, and he points out that this is not a fair criticism, right? The highest good for a human is not physical pleasure. There are higher pleasures that we desire, and so a happy life is one in which we're able to satisfy those higher desires, not just the lower pleasures. Okay, and of course he emphasizes that a happy life involves minimizing suffering, right? Now, not all suffering and pain can be eliminated from a life, but a life will be happier the more unnecessary pain there is. Okay, so those are aspects of Mill's conception of happiness. And in defending it, he's trying to argue that a happy life is one that is distinct for a human, is distinct from the happy life for a pig, right? That human beings cannot be satisfied by the same pleasures that satisfy a pig, right? That there are certain kinds of activities and capacities and pleasures that belong to a human life, without which that life is not worth living. So it would be better to experience some pain, right, than to give up our nature as human beings, give up our capacity for higher pleasures and certain types of activities that belong to the human, even if that would mean experiencing more pain, or frustrating some of our other desires. Okay. And so in that sense, the standard for a good life, right, happiness, pleasure, right, for human beings is it's a higher standard than the standard we would set for pigs. Okay. All right, so what are the attractions of hedonism? Let me pause, and so in the second video, this will be the first of two videos. In the second video, we'll work through the attractions of hedonism in more detail. Okay, but just really quickly, right? One thing to say is there are many ways of becoming happy, and this is Schaefer-Landau in Chapter 1 of the Fundamentals of Ethics. He works through different reasons for thinking that hedonism is the best theory of well-being. Well, there's many paths to happiness, and so there's going to be many models of the good life. And this makes it look like a more democratic view, right? A less elitist view, and that's one of the attractions. Okay, I'm going to pause there, and we'll come back to the rest of it in the next video. Okay.